We are back for our second session of the discussion I had yesterday. We discussed many things yesterday. I'll try to put them in a little bit of order for you that will make sense as a review, and then move on to things for today. Questions people had yesterday, basically, what is Palestine? To whom does it belong? You'll oftentimes hear Palestine belongs to Palestinians, and therefore all these wars are just to take it back. I showed that if you study the history, Palestine is a region. It's given its name by the Romans once they exiled the Judeans. They did not want the word Judean or Judea used ever again. By the way, the word Palestine does not appear in the New Testament. It does not appear in any of the Roman inscriptions prior to around the 2nd century. The Romans intentionally wanted to wipe the term Judea out of history. The Jews were killed, exiled, enslaved in the southern region, and Jerusalem was intentionally renamed. The area was renamed Syria Capitolina, and the region was called Palestine. The Arabs took that over when they invaded in the late 600s. When they invaded the area, pushed out the Byzantiums, they kept it as a geographical district. So remember, when you hear Palestine, think the Rocky Mountains or think northeastern United States. It's not named after a people, it's a region, and then people who move there might be called that, but I don't recall seeing any records referring to the citizens there as Palestinian. Now, if you look it up, you might find a record here or there. That doesn't mean it was in its dominant usage. Same thing when the Turks took over the district. If you look at the history of the maps of Palestine as a regional district, the maps go up and down. Sometimes it's the southern part of the Syrian province. Sometimes it's between Jerusalem and the ocean. Gaza has its own district. So if you look at the history of the way that the Turks ruled the area, and they name their different districts and provinces, the name is quite fluid. So I want to say again, it does not name a people. The term Palestine or Palestina is used for the administration of government. Where does the term come from? In the ancient land of Israel, as you might know, there were the so-called 7 Canaanite tribes. The Ivrim, the Hebrews, were there for a while, went to Egypt and came back. A group shows up around the time of King Saul, maybe a little bit earlier, called the Plishtim. From the word Peleshet, and the areas, we're going to say now southwest land of Israel, where Gaza is today, was called Peleshet. They had five main cities, so it was I think a hentocracy, 5-city rule. Where did the people of Peleshet come from? They seem to have been refugees from some kind of catastrophe out in the Mediterranean, or they were simply expansionists and came over from northern Egypt. The word liflosh in Hebrew means to invade. Some people say they were the invaders. Some people call them the sea people, but it was a non-indigenous population that arrived in the land of Israel. We're going to say around the year 1413, 1200 BCE. If you look in the Bible, during the times of Saul and King David, they are in constant warfare with the Plishtim. And eventually, during the time of King David, the Plishtim are defeated and simply integrated into the Israelite nation. Even though Israel splits into northern Israel, southern Judea, there's no more heard of the Plishtim or the area Peleshet. We move forward. The Romans conquer, we're going to call it now Judea. A revolution breaks out to expel the Romans, 67 to 70. The Romans put down the war. Another rebellion breaks out from 132 to 135 CE, called the Bar Kokhba Revolution. That's when the Jews are expelled. So the diaspora of the Jews from the land of Israel, from Judea, begins in the early 2nd century CE, and then the Romans rename it Palestine to eradicate any memory of Jewish existence there. Now, this is all factually true. You can find it in history books. I'm not trying to persuade you of anything except the historical truth. Again, so when the Arabs come, they leave the names. The Roman names, for example, Naples was called Nablus. Other places that the Romans had taken away the Hebrew name and put in a Roman name Typically, the Arabs left the Roman name just transliterated according to their own alphabet. Again, not a people, but people who lived in a district. When you get to the 20th century, where you have the rising idea of national groups, the rise of nationalism began in Europe in the 1800s, in the 1900s, and then moved all over the world, including into this region. And at the same time that there was a Jewish consciousness of Zionism, meaning a state for the Jewish people, there began to be a consciousness that the Arabs who lived in Palestine were not just citizens of the region called Palestine, but actually had a separate identity called Palestinian. Many Jews say it's not a real identity, you're just a bunch of immigrants from one place to another. That doesn't matter. Once a group of people see themselves as a national group, no one can talk them out of it. So I don't get into this discussion. If they live in Palestine, want to call themselves a Palestinian, and want their separate Palestinian state, that's just a fact. When the Zionists arrived, it seems that the Zionists had thought they would live in the Ottoman Empire or under the British Mandate, and typically when there's an empire, they keep the different peoples in the empire at bay. Once the mandate was going to come to an end, both on the Arab Palestinian side and the Jewish Palestinian side, they both know there was a war coming. That's why I'm one of those who prefers to call the 1948-49 war not the Israeli War of Independence because the British voluntarily left, but rather the Palestine Civil War or the Jewish-Arab Palestine Civil War. Jews and Arabs were fighting over the land Palestine. The UN tried to broker a deal in October of 1947, giving some areas to the Jews, some areas to the Arabs, mostly around population centers. They had been studying it for a couple of years, actually. When they announced the plan, neither side liked it. The Jews saw it as indefensible. The Arabs saw it as completely illegal that the UN should come in and divide up the land. When Israel was going to be declared a state in May 1948, the Arabs said, if you declare a state, we will eradicate you. We will kill every one of you and push you into the sea. If you don't declare a state, you can live a minority in an Arab state. But there had already been so much bitter fighting going on from November 47 to May of 1948, including massacres, that I think the Jews in Palestine had a few choices. Either get on a boat and go home, but the Holocaust had just ended, and that wasn't a feasible idea. They didn't see themselves living under a liberal, tolerant Arab regime, I think very much because of the massacres, and therefore the decision was to fight for the land that the UN had given them. So for the Israelis in May of 1948, it was a defensive war. When the 7 armies came out and a locally organized army called the Arab Liberation Army, the ALA, they invaded. This is not the time for me to give a history of the 1948 war. I will do that another time. But the fact that the other side invaded put them at a disadvantage, and here's why. People have no idea what it means to create an expeditionary army. I want you to think about it yourself. You put 100 men to go fight, well, they have to have vehicles, and the vehicles have to have mechanics, and you have to bring wreckers, meaning like tow trucks that can take off the road a disabled vehicle. You have to have technical crews that can put together make sure that the machine guns and the cannons are all firing correctly. You have to have a medical crew. So to send 100 men into combat typically means you need at least another 100 men accompanying it and vehicles that can make the road. So it sounds easy. We're just going to invade. But what it takes to get 100, 200, 500 people somewhere is really exhausting and has to be planned well. The Arab countries had no experience in creating an expeditionary force. None of them did well. On the other hand, the Jewish Yeshuvim were hardened ever since the 1930s, which means there were trenches, barbed wire, they had Molotov cocktails. They didn't have great weapons. They had rifles and maybe a few machine guns, maybe a mortar. But because the Arab side had not been expecting these, what we call the hardened kibbutz, because none of the Arab villages were hardened, they really weren't prepared. They hadn't trained to fight that way. So if you look at the history of the 1948 war, what you have is relatively modern Arab armies not trained to attack hardened defenses, and the Jews would not retreat and would die in place. Why would the Jews not retreat or die in place? Because prisoners had already been massacred, so they realized there is no surrendering here. Some surrendered successfully, others were massacred. And secondly, as Ben-Gurion said, if you leave that place, you're just going to come to the next one, the next one, the next one, and then we're all going to be on the beach in Tel Aviv, and then we're going to make our last stand. You might as well make your last stand there than make a last stand undefended on the beach in Tel Aviv. So he convinced everybody, die in place. That's another thing these armies were not used to, is that every single person was going to die in place and not back up. So it was an incredible miscalculation on the other side. At 1949, an armistice was signed. What many people call today the 1967 borders. They were never borders. They were the armistice lines of the 1948 war. If you look in the armistice agreements, and you can all look them up, by the way, everything's online, you will see that in the agreements, it said that the signatories, meaning the Arabs, are not, it's not a peace deal, that they can start the war at any time. It was a disengagement. The war was still on. So very important to keep your minds, because many people think there were 1967 borders. There were no 1967 borders. It was a 1949 armistice line with the understanding the war could start up at any time they wanted. And from the Arab side, the 1948 was a catastrophic setback, but they fully intended to continue the job and destroy the state of Israel. This is the constant rhetoric from 48 to 67. Many of you know that in 1967, the Egyptians put hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the Israeli border down on the Negev. The Syrians were constantly subjecting Israel to artillery bombardments. The Jordanians were trying to stay out of it. They got pulled into it, and Israel conducted a preemptive strike. There's no historical scholar in the world that does not think that preemptive strike was not morally justified. It was a morally justified preemptive strike. The Egyptian army was barely ready to attack, not trained in the defense, and lost the war. The Israelis actually did beg the Jordanians not to get into it, but the Jordanians more or less were told, King Hussein in particular, if you don't get into this war, you will be considered a traitor. In a rather haphazard way, the Jordanians began shooting artillery. They sent some planes over to attack Israeli cities, and Israel said, this is not sustainable. They went in, and to their utter shock, the most difficult army that Israel fought in 1948 folded very, very quickly. So Israel suddenly found itself in charge of the West Bank, in charge of Jerusalem, etc. Again, when Israel attacked Egypt, they went through Gaza, and they suddenly found themselves, having defeated the Egyptian army, in charge of the Sinai Desert, in charge of Gaza, in charge of the West Bank. Now, from 1947 on, for many years, I'll say a decade, Israel tried to make peace. Even though Jordan had not created a Palestinian state out of the West Bank, and Egypt did not create a Palestinian state in Gaza, Israel said, you can have all this land back. You can give them their state. Anything you want with it, just give us a peace deal. Most of you know in the history of Israel-Palestine, they did not give a peace deal. So tragically, they didn't give the Palestinians a state in 1948 when they could have on the West Bank and Gaza, because their idea was, we want everything. It's either everything or nothing. As Israel tried to trade land for peace from 67 to 77, nobody would reply. When Menachem Begin came into power in 77, he resurged the idea, we never lost that war either. They have a claim to the land. We have a claim to the land. We're not kicking anybody out of the West Bank and Gaza, but we're going to move people in. And that began what we call now today the settler movement. All right, that's a very brief history, and you can see what happens now is that Gaza used to be Egyptian, fell under Israeli control in 1967. The Israeli rule of Gaza after 1967 was relatively enlightened. They conducted their business, and it was, as prosperous as any poor country can be. It was a prosperous country. There were terrorist attacks launched from Gaza into Israel, but as I mentioned last night, the metaphor would be a high-crime city, something Israel was basically able to tolerate. Israel put settlements inside of Gaza, farms, some of them quite beautiful. They were ordered to tear everything out. because it was going to be given back to now to the Palestinians. This was in the 1990s. Israel finally entirely pulls out of Gaza in 2005. So the Israeli occupation ends, pulls out. The world hope was, including myself, that Gaza would take this and show the world what they had in mind with a Palestinian state. So I remember, create the Garden of Eden. You have all these Israeli moshavim and kibbutzim. They're ready to go, move in, take over the equipment. Mostly remember what happened is they went in and they ripped everything apart. I was saddened, but I understood. I mean, they really hate Jews and hate Israelis. They didn't want to use Israeli machines, Israeli rooms, eat in an Israeli dining hall. So those things that were left for them, by the way, were eradicated. In my mind, not surprisingly, I wish they would have used them. That would have been a good sign, but they didn't. As soon as Israel left in 2005, the rockets began to flow, which stunned people that said, Israel has finally moved out of an area of Palestine, left it entirely to yourself to be autonomous. This is the future. And immediately you shoot rockets into Israel. Israel was not ready for this. The Fatah government was there, and they said, we can't control it. It's these guys called Hamas. Israel didn't know what to do. They didn't want to go back in. It was a very difficult period. There was another election. I believe this was 2007. You can look it up. Hamas came into power, elected, and then never another election. Hamas is an organization, again, you can look it up, that in its charter was dedicated to the killing of every Jew in the land of Israel, to destroy the state of Israel, and it's filled with tropes taken right out of Nazi literature. The Jews are the cause of the world's evils. They are the ones who created drug addiction, prostitution, everything else. So as with the Nazis, get rid of the Jews and the world will be better. The Jews must die. They are the cancer on the world. Now, they've changed that sense, but you can still go back and read the old charter. It's still out there. From my perspective, the intention of the first charter was never ended. So since this time, there has been in Gaza what you might call one of the main rejectionist forces in the Middle East, Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran. There'll be no normalization, no peace, no accommodation, only warfare, the decision to destroy Israel and to murder every Jew. That is their line. Now, during this time, as Israel began to develop defense against the rocket attacks, I think the meaning of the rocket attacks wasn't internalized because most rockets could be intercepted with the Iron Dome, and Israel had shelters. But I want us to think, if 3,000 rockets came over the border from Mexico to San Diego, just think for a moment, I think we take that as war. And I don't think we say, well, we have some missile systems and we have basements in San Diego, so we're just going to let it go. I think you'd see an overwhelming American response that wherever that came from, it had to be destroyed and never, ever happen again. So Israel got used to it because the idea of going back into Gaza and taking it over, the idea was it'll cause far too many casualties and we don't want to rule Gaza. So Israel built defenses. They built fences, and they built the Iron Dome. By the way, all the settlements that were recently taken over and slaughtered, that was part of the defensive strategy. They all had Konanut groups. They all had groups ready to defend. Army bases were very nearby. The thought was that these places that were attacked were a first line of defense that could hold the enemy off for an hour until the army arrived. Of course, now we see that the policy was completely unworkable, had not been thought out. Probably no war games had been done, and that ended up being an utterly disastrous policy for Israelis. But that's why they are so close to the Gaza border. It was part of a quasi-military decision to create a front line that the Egyptians or the Palestinians would have to go through to get anywhere near the interior of the country. They may have provided that first line of defense, but no one expected that providing the first line of defense would create this kind of slaughter. Now, so remember, when you think of the Gaza perspective, this is really important. Hamas wants to destroy Israel. They want to murder every Israeli, and they want to butcher every Israeli. Remember, that's in their consciousness. So whenever they mention, we're shooting rockets because some Israeli soldiers went into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We're shooting soldiers because the tenants are being evicted in Sheikh Jarrah. Whenever they come up for some reason to send over 3,000 rockets, the world takes that seriously and says, oh, if Israeli soldiers had not gone into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, remember people were throwing stones down onto the people at the Wailing Wall. The soldiers went up to make them knock it off. They found huge stores of rocks up there. No one got killed. They were able to arrest people, but it went out into the Arab world as Israel is trying to take back the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and people fall for it, I have to say, because Israel has no desire to take the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The rockets start shooting. Now, at that point, now try to think, it's whatever other country in the world. They're shooting rockets at your people in order to murder your people. The fact that Israel can intercept them, and the fact that they can find a reinforced room or a bomb shelter, doesn't mean that the intention is not mass murder. Again, if someone shot 5,000 rockets into where I am in Los Angeles, it would cause mass murder, probably 10,000 people in one blow, because we don't have the Iron Dome above us and we don't have bomb shelters. Now, it turned into kind of a game. Every couple of years, they got mad about something, and from my perspective, and I think this is historically true, rather contrived. The response was profoundly disproportionate, meaning shooting rockets at civilian cities. Israel was able to intercept them. People ran to bomb shelters, and typically not more than 10, 20 Israelis would be killed. There might be a company squad level incursion to arrest somebody or take out that. Israel would bomb, trying to hit the rocket launchers. But of course, the rocket launchers were hidden in hospitals, in schools, and in mosques. It was always very, very messy. Within a day, the world press attacked Israel. As far as I know, the rockets were never called a war crime, but if Israel went in and a civilian was accidentally killed, that was the war crime. And this is the problem with the UN that I mentioned last night. Now, there's a group called the UN Watch. The relationship of the UN with Israel is tragic, but it's factual. It's tragic, but it's factual. There's one set of rules for Israel, another set of rules for everyone else, including Palestine, other places. Israel is held to an impossible, in my mind, nonsensical kind of standard. I think many of you have heard of all the countries that are censured by the UN. Israel is 10 times more censured than any country. Most countries are never censored, but more than China with its human rights abuses, more than Russia, more than anybody else, more than Iran. It's Israel, 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 Israel. Okay, so if you go to UN Watch and study this, it is simply just, it's not, I don't even use the word unfair anymore. It is a ridiculous, I'll say the organization is ridiculous. The treatment of Israel is just ridiculous. All it is an arm of the movement to delegitimize the state of Israel as a terror state. Even when Israel is being subjected to terror, random rocket attacks, Israel tries to stop it, accidentally kills a civilian. When they're trying to kill civilians, Israel's the terror state. So look that up yourselves. If I'm wrong, let me know. I don't think that I'm wrong. So within the consciousness of Hamas, the goal is to murder every Jew. So people have said, what was the goal of this attack, October 7th and 8th, and somewhat ongoing? What did they hope to get out of it? If they wanted to grab hostages, they grabbed their hostages. Remember, one of their goals is to massacre Jews, and that's hard for people to get. They say, I don't understand it. I say, did you see recently where that white kid went into a black church and just mowed down 10 people? For what goal? Every now and then we see it, that a person just attacks the other ethnic group and murders them, expects to either get shot, put in jail, and live their life in jail, warm bed, three free meals a day, TV, whatever they expect their life is going to be. But there are people who like to murder the other. That's just what it is. So going in and getting the land, I think the primary motivation was to hurt Israel. Secondly, murder Israelis. Third, take hostages. And fourth, here's something that they said. We're going to go in. We're showing you that they're weak. You can get in too. They wanted Hezbollah to attack. They wanted Israeli Arabs to join an uprising and throw off their oppressive masters. And again, if 1 million Palestinians had gone out with hammers and saws and screwdrivers and knives, and each one tried to take down one Israeli, it would have been horrible. They wanted the West Bank to an uprising, and thousands of people would attack each settlement and massacre the people there. They wanted Jordan to join in. They wanted Iraq to join in. They wanted Iran to join in. They invited the entire world to join in. This is factual. They said it. If the Israeli Arabs had joined, if the Palestinians on the West Bank had joined, if Hezbollah had joined, there would have been carnage. I think you would have had more than 10,000 Jews killed. You might have had 100,000 Arabs killed, because once that starts and you can't tell the friend from the enemy, I think the Israeli army would have done anything they needed to do to protect their civilians. It wouldn't have been, oh, you kill 10 of us, we'll kill 10 of yours. It's like the metaphor of World War II. You came to our country and destroyed 10 battleships in our port. We're going to go over to Japan and take out 10 battleships in your port, call it even, everybody go home. That's not how wars work. When Japan attacked the United States and the Philippines and Singapore and Malaysia and all those other countries, the idea, it wasn't, we'll just tit for tat back to Japan. Japan had to be defeated. And it's the same thing with Germany. Germany had to be defeated. And if the people of Germany were not going to surrender, we had to go all the way in and make sure that Hitler was dead before we were going to stop that war. That's this kind of war. When Hamas launched the attack was A, to kill, to gain a little bit, get a little bit of land, take captives, but also lead an uprising to destroy the state of Israel and murder every Jew. That was their goal. I'm pretty sure I saw it. If it doesn't exist, let me know. I'll take it back. Just imagine if they had succeeded. The fact they didn't succeed does not mean they didn't want to do it. The fact that they didn't succeed was Israeli Arabs, Palestinians on the West Bank, Hezbollah, Jordan, Iraq, they didn't want to join in. That doesn't mean that's not what the Hamas wanted. Always remember that. The goal last weekend was to destroy the state of Israel. The fact that they weren't successful does not mean that wasn't their goal. It might have worked if they had done more organization with Israeli Arabs and Palestinians on the West Bank with Hezbollah. I don't know why they didn't want to join in. I mean, if they really want the destruction of the state of Israel, that was the day. That day's not going to come back. If there ever was one day to destroy the state of Israel, it was Shmini Atzeret Shabbat, October 7th, 2023. That was the day. That day won't come back in my mind in eternity. That was the day to destroy Israel. That's what they wanted on that day. They didn't succeed. I talked last night a little bit about the Israeli response. I just want to speak very briefly. For all kinds of reasons, Israel had what I call peace fever. So soldiers went home on the weekend, as is custom in every Israeli military unit, unless there's a high state of readiness. There was a basic training base nearby. Most of them went home on the weekend. There was a division headquarters. All the combat soldiers went home. But within an hour or so of the attack, Israeli soldiers who were stationed or lived nearby streamed into the area, apparently in small groups, just created little squads, and they went out fighting. As you know, in the 36 hours of October 7th to 8th, over 100 Israeli soldiers died, but they killed 10 times that number of terrorists. Firefighters, police officers, rescue teams, civilians, even at the festival. There were a few people who grabbed a gun and fought, died themselves. The few young drill instructors at the recruit base, they sent to the recruits, locked them up in bunkers, got their rifles, maybe a half a dozen young women, and fought at the gate. They fought valiantly. There were a lot of dead terrorists outside the gate, but they all were killed. So there was the stories are just coming out in the Hebrew press, one story after another of beyond imagination valor, fighting under the worst conditions, going back to what Golda Meir said to Joe Biden, 1973. Joe Biden said, first time I went to Israel was 1973. He met with Golda Meir. He got the intelligence assessment, and he said, this is very troubling. And they had gone outside for a photo shoot, and she motions him. This is what he said recently. And she said, we have a secret weapon. And he bent down to her ear, and she said, we have nowhere else to go. Okay? And Biden said that has stuck with him ever since 1973 when he had that conversation with Golda Meir as a young senator. That's what I think, why the Israelis run to the attack, not go to the back and wait till the reserves showed up. There is nowhere else to go. If these people get through, they're just going to murder more people and more people and more people. So I am deeply moved by the amount of valor that was displayed by anybody who could fight, did fight. All right, that's as far as a little bit about Palestine, a little bit about what the intentions were. Just a few more things about Gaza. People are trying to tell this next narrative. The Palestinians are suffering so much, they have no choice but attack. I want you to think that for a minute. There's a lot of poor people in the world. Not all of them mutilate and massacre people. Yeah, there's poverty in the West Bank. And, when Hamas came to power and Egypt and Israel saw what's up, Egypt closed their border. Remember, there is an Egyptian border that's closed. Israel closed Israel's border. All stuffs that come into Hamas are offloaded in Ashdod and then trucked down into Gaza. Tons and tons and tons a day. There is interdiction, but all the goods get through. Why? Because Israel wants to open the containers to make sure that arms are not being sent through. Not very successfully, as you can see, because if there really were a blockade, where do the motorcycles come from? Where do the pickup trucks come from? Where do the paragliders come from? Where the AK-47s come from? Where the RPGs come from? Where those clothes come from? Those bandoliers. When you look at the truck going through Gaza with the raped and mutilated young woman in the back of the truck, look behind the truck. There's villas, there's shops, there's stores, there's a well-paved street. Go to Google Images. Beautiful Gaza City. So yes, it's a poor country, but goods are getting in. The people are not starving. Now, I'm not sure why it's a poor country, but there are other poor countries in the Middle East where Egypt and Israel have not closed their borders. So yes, there's poverty. Is it because the borders are closed? I don't know. It could be. But there's no blockade in the original sense of the word blockade. It's not an outdoor prison, as it were, run by Israel. Israel doesn't run anything there. There are schools, universities, newspapers, cell phones, traffic jams. It's a poor country, but it's a country run by, in my opinion, an incredibly inept government that doesn't care about its citizens. So this idea that it's an Israeli-occupied outdoor prison is just profoundly untrue and wants to add to the narrative of delegitimizing Israel. And again, this is not my opinion. I'm telling you something factual. You go check it out. If I'm wrong, please tell me. So there's no blockade in the original sense of the word. Everything gets through. Not only has Israel closed her borders, Egypt has closed her borders. You want to know why Egypt closed the borders against Gaza? Ask Egypt. They're very clear why they do not want an open border. Not a controlled border. Almost nothing goes back and forth across that border. So the idea that they're so oppressed, they have nothing else to do but attack. I want to tell you that the image of people, it's describing people as if they have no will, they have no conscience. Just that, you poke the animal enough, the animal attacks. No one forced anybody to behead babies. That's not from being poor. Nobody forced anybody to rape women next to their dead friends, right? To massacre families. I could be poor and upset, and I want to go after whoever my oppressor is, but that doesn't mean I mutilate people. So the story that they were forced into it by Israel. Listen to this. They were forced into it by Israel because of a blockade that doesn't exist, the outdoor prison that didn't exist. They weren't forced into it by anybody except their own ideology to massacre and mutilate Jews. Now, if someone can come up with a convincing alternative explanation, I'll take it, but it's not the poverty, because there are millions of people in poverty who don't mutilate and massacre people. It is because This is the last point I want to make this morning until I take any questions, is because the history of what I would call the idea of colonialism. I want to spend a few minutes there. We have to go back into a little bit of time, and I have to avoid turning this into a 2-hour lecture that I would love to give another time, but not today. And that's when the idea of colonialism, socialism, communism, and the left came into being. When the Soviet Union, let's say, was on its feet in the 1920s, they immediately created programs with the KGB to go into other countries to weaken them, to create a communist revolution, to get them into the Soviet bloc. Now, what was their appeal? Now, this is something that's, from me, tragically, factually true. And I'm gonna put myself here. The idea of socialism is profoundly attractive to young people, especially if they've never run their own business. If you've never been in the free market and you work for somebody else, the employer doesn't pay me enough. I should get more money. We workers should run this shop. All those people over there are making money. They're making money off of me. I'm producing a chair and they're in the chair business. Why are they making millions? I get minimum wage. So this is an interpretation of Marxism which pretends to be in favor of the working person, and it is an ideology that is built for young people. If you look at the protests, they're not just protesting Israel, they're protesting capitalism, which they could not define in one sentence. They're anti-colonialism. It is understood to be a colonial power. If you don't know that, it's a little bit shocking, but it's true. So the hatred of Israel fits into what I'm going to say a hard leftist narrative about colonialism and capitalism, which is bad, communism and socialism, which is good. So remember, there's always been a hatred of America because we are capitalists. I remember going to some event somewhere where a person was about all the horrible, this is post-Vietnam, we'd have to talk about that, all the horrible things the United States does. I said, well, what about the Soviet Union? What about the Gulag? I don't see any election. The person got very upset. Soviet Union has its trouble, but America is evil. Now, once a conversation starts like that, I realize there's nowhere to go because we're living in alternative universes. But if you look at the left, the hard left, not the left that I grew up in, which was fair shake for the workers, unions, pay teachers more. I was in what you might call a run-of-the-mill leftist democratic point of view, although my parents had been communists in the 40s, early 50s. But once it became aware how evil it was, they went from being hard leftists to what I'll call soft leftists of the Democratic Party. That's how I grew up. So remember, if you ask, why are these young people doing it? It's part of the young person identity to identify on the hard left because that's where the revolution is. That's where the struggle is. In fact, I heard one person chanting, whatever word rhymes with revolution. No resolution, only revolution. Revolution what? Revolution where? But they love the idea of revolution. They wear Che Guevara t-shirts, and they wear red bandanas, and they dress up like, they're walking around posing, like they're going to do something. They love to march, they love to sing, they love to stomp, and they love to hate. I don't know where they are 30 years from now. I wish someone would do a long-term analysis where a pro-socialist is. We remember what happened to the Chicago 7, by the way. They became capitalists. They went from the what were they? The hippie to the yuppie. I mean, most people within 10 years, they're not part of the revolution anymore. They want to be part of the of the system. Almost always, the people who were preaching revolution left the revolution and joined the system. So what's going on here? The Soviet Union began to put out this message: the only just government is socialism. Now look what the Soviet Union was able to do. When they took over Czechoslovakia and Hungary and other countries, there were free elections. And as Milan Kundera writes in his fabulous books, he says, the best people voted in the communists because they made a case for worker-controlled factories and divide up the land among the peasants. Everything sounded ideal and idealistic and perfect, create a Garden of Eden. So in the countries, in the East Bloc that became the Iron Wall, behind the Iron Wall, they voted in the communists, of course. That's the last election they ever participated in until 1990. What came in next was the secret police. What came in the next was a murderous system of tyranny and the depredations of a central economy. And I say depredations because there's no chance for prosperity. You compare East Germany and West Germany, North Korea to South Korea. There's just something number one, I think, evil as far as record of human rights, and destructive about socialism that can be proven. But young people love socialism, as did I. When I was a young kid, I have a library on socialism, still have it in my library, and I would say, why don't the workers run the factories? And why are we living in a crappy apartment in Long Beach? And those people in Beverly Hills are in big houses. And why don't we distribute the money? And I mean, I had all the same questions. I didn't know anything. And my parents were a former communist, socialist, Democrat. They couldn't give me much of an answer either. I finally went to school and learned a little bit about things. But that's the point of view. Now, the second thing is so if remember, socialism, the residue of the Soviet Union, the hatred of capitalism is very much part of American academics. The senior academics now were students in the 70s. I can't overstate this, the attachment to socialism, hatred of America, hatred of capitalism. Second thing is hatred of colonialism. So it's very important to understand that one thing they said was that the European powers, we're going to call this as a metaphor, the white world, took over the dark world and more or less looted their resources, enslaved the people, and took their wealth back into the place where the colonies came from. So you look at the British colonies, the French colonies, the Belgian colonies. Some were actually despicable, depraved regimes. Look what the French did in Haiti, for example, what the Belgians did in the Congo. On any moral scale, it was one of the most destructive, evil things that has ever happened on planet Earth, especially what happened in Haiti. And the Haitian revolt against the French, it was a revolt in kind. It was a horrible, horrible chain of violence in Haiti. And go read that story yourself if you want to see some of the worst aspects of the human condition. I would say eventually on both sides. So in any case, once you move through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, you have liberation movements going on. There is a People's Liberation Army in Vietnam. So it's not just a rebellion against the French and then the Americans. It's the People's Liberation Army, which meant the goal to establish a communist state once the imperialist, capitalist colonizers go home. You had this in Algeria. You have it in other places, and if you want to read a good book on this, read Paul Johnson's Modern Times. It's one of the books that actually changed my mind on all this. He discusses the history of liberation. The history of liberation is anti-colonial, pro-socialist, and the following very sad fact that I'm going to share with you. The mere existence of someone from outside the country, so-called colonists, is such a severe act of aggression that they may be murdered. Listen to this, because I couldn't understand when the Vietnam War was going on why the Viet Cong blew up a club and killed 130 people, including a bunch of kids my age. I didn't understand how that was going to help them win the war. At that point, I started to wonder, what's with this blowing up civilians and conducting a war? It turns out the mere fact that you are in Vietnam as an American is an act of war, and therefore you should be killed. So this idea comes in. A colonist living on so-called colonized land must be murdered. And then you see this whenever you have these liberation armies, these liberation forces. One of the assumptions is the colonizers, meaning the person from France or England or Belgium, they are fair target. Now, if you look at their literature and look at the protests of the Israel haters, Israel is an imperialistic colonial regime working for European colonialists, especially that big colonial power, the United States. That's the larger background. So you look at the protests. Israel is a colonial state. Now, I've had this discussion, as is my want. People say to me, Israel is a colonial state. I said, what do you mean, colonial state? External power has sent its forces to take over a state, rape it of its resources, send the resources home, and control the population. I say, thank you. That's what I know. I said, however, there is no state that the Jews of Israel came from. In fact, they fled from states. They're not working for the Russians. They're not working for the Americans. They're not working for the British. They're not working for the French. They are called immigrants. Now, once you say that the Jews are immigrants to Palestine, then you start looking, as I have, at the great immigration movements that have been going across the world for all of known history. The great immigration movements in the late Roman Empire, the great immigration movements around our time in Egypt. So there's always been, until modern times with the setting of national borders, groups, large groups emigrating from one place to another. And the Jews fleeing from Europe, fleeing back to Palestine, that's not that unusual. They're not colonists, they're immigrants. Secondly, when, I think in a very unadvised way, that when the 48 war broke out, the Arab states expelled their Jews. And the majority of Jewish population are descendants from expelled Jews from the North Africa and the Middle East. Under no definition are they colonists, because they were expelled from their countries. They didn't come from Egypt to colonize Palestine. They were expelled from Egypt and sent to Palestine, Israel. However, people asked last night, what is this young people animus against Israel? It fits in the box of imperialism, colonialism. Wrapped into that is socialism and the idea that the mere existence of someone from a colonial power should be murdered. Hence, terror attacks. If you've ever wondered why the terror attacks, it is a preferred tactic among the liberation movements in order to discourage the colonial power to pack up and go home, except, in this case, Israelis have no home to go to. So when you combine the Hamas addiction to murder and wanting to murder every Jew, including liberation ideology that says every colonist should be murdered, you add on to that a sense that Palestine belongs to Arabs, therefore Israel is a colonial power that took the nation away from the rightful so-called owners of the land. That narrative is the narrative that fuels the Palestine Liberation Army, the Palestine, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. It fuels some of the ideology of Hamas, even though it is an Islamicist group. It fuels the imagination of many hard left-wing academics and their indoctrinated flock, the hard-wing students. So it's part of a larger thing, but the battle is being played out in Israel, and it's been being played out really since the 1940s. So I'll end with one small thing, and then I'll see if there are any questions or hear any questions that have been put in the chat. What's going to happen next? Now, many people last night expressed a concern that if Israel would go in, there would be a lot of casualties. This is one reason that the other times that Israel went in to stop the rocket attacks, they paused because they didn't want to take too many casualties. You send 40 commandos in, a few get shot, they rescue a hostage rarely, they take out a couple of the senior rocket crews, occasionally they pull out, 2 get killed, 5 get wounded, the country mourns. In fact, I said last night, a few friends of our daughters were people who were wounded in those operations and still suffer from trauma. So the idea is don't send a lot of troops because a lot will get kidnapped, a lot will get killed, and the country, from a morale perspective, will not be able to suffer it. Clear? Now, because of the recent attacks, where, as far as we can tell, about 1,000 civilians were massacred, and Israelis came to the front lines in patches in small groups to hold the line. Around 300 soldiers, police, etc. were killed, butchered. I think, as I said last night, The butchery at the music festival has done especially damage to our daughters, peers, and generation, because they were the ones that were wearing the floral shirts, and the guys had braided hair and light beards, and we call kind of version of American hippies from the 60s and 70s, went to music festivals, wore sandals, loved trance music. They lived in what I would call a peace fever world. We can have a music festival a couple miles from Gaza and everybody's safe because the world has changed. Well, as you know, there were a couple hundred people there that were massacred. The natural friends of Palestine, as it were, they were, I would say, to a person, they were pro-peace, pro-two states, haters of Netanyahu. I mean, you might say they were the people that would be part of a leftist move to make Israel less military and grant a Palestinian state. I'm not sure they could have done it, but that was them. Well, they were the ones who were murdered. So that generation has looked at this and said, even though we were the good people, we want to fight for Palestinians. We belong to the pro-Palestinian organizations. We want a peace deal. We want to ameliorate their lives. They attacked us. Realizing Hamas doesn't make any distinction between a good Israeli and a bad Israeli. They want to kill every Israeli. They didn't just go to the military bases, which were not far away, which by they successfully overran 2 of them. They killed every civilian in place. Something has happened in Israeli consciousness where Israel has called up a couple of 100,000 reservists, which I don't think has been done. I don't think this many were called up in either of the 2 wars, at least all at one time. And there are thousands going down who have not been called. In fact, I mentioned that our daughter Abigail tried to get called up. They said, we just don't have any room for you. I mean, we don't need another combat medic. Stay up in Tel Aviv, do what you can there. We'll call you if we need you. They're oversubscribed with people that age, trading their guitars in for a rifle and trading their sandals in for boots and running down there wanting to be part of it because they have, as it were, been alerted to the fact that this peace fever that everybody was suffering from, including me, the fever broke. And they realized if they get through, they will kill every one of us and my little brother and my little sister and my mother and my grandmother and everybody. So that's an awful thing. I don't think this generation will ever heal from this scar. I think Shmini Atzeret 2023, I used to call it the blank holiday. It is not the blank holiday now anymore. I don't know what it's going to be called, but Shmini Atzeret now has a meaning, and the meaning is there are people that want to kill us, and we better be ready. I don't know what the one word for that is, but by next Shmini Atzeret, we will have the meaning. I loved Shmini Atzeret because I love the idea that there's a blank holiday. We get to swim, dance, whatever we want, bear the fruit of our work from the high holidays and Sukkot, and now here we are. And it has a meaning that nobody wanted it to have, and that meaning is going to be defined clearly. So is Israel going to go in on land? I believe they will. I believe they're going to have to go into Gaza like the American army went into Germany. It's going to be one house at a time, one block at a time, heavy on destroying, because just as when the Americans went into Germany, we didn't send troops in to build up areas and allow them to get decimated by snipers in the updoor windows. When the American army went into Germany, after a couple of those incidents, the local company commander brought up a platoon of tanks, and they blew up every building until the town surrendered. Because to send a company of soldiers down the street in a occupied city is to invite half your men being slaughtered. This is well known in the studies of urban warfare. We studied a little bit when I went my urban warfare training. I believe, not sure that Israeli commanders are going to conduct urban warfare old school. They're not going to sacrifice their men because a civilian might get killed. It's either protect the civilian or protect my soldiers. And I think that's going to be what they're going to do until they're going to get to Gaza City. And they would prefer everybody just leave because they got to get to Gaza City and they got to uncover the underground warren of caves under Gaza City. Some are 5 stories deep, fortified, where the weapons factories are, where the bunks for the terrorists are. Israel has to get to the underground tunnels in Gaza City. They can only get that if they conquer Gaza City. As you know, Israel said, please clear out of here, go south. We don't want to destroy any civilians. Israel has published a corridor. Will they be taken care of down there? I think yes. They're going to be provided food and water as long as they stay inside that area of Gaza. But Israel has to eradicate Hamas, and the way to eradicate Hamas is to attack the tunnel system where the senior Hamas members are hiding. They're waiting for Israel to pull out so they can just start again, and Israel does not want to allow this to start again.